instructions that the judges gave you, she mentioned the truth multiple times. I think this is a quote from Buddha. 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. So in this case, where will you find the truth? The truth is going to come from the evidence. What is the evidence? Well, the evidence is going to be the testimony, like the judge spoke to you about, the testimony that's given from the witness stand, and the exhibits that are entered into evidence here in the courtroom. Now, the judge also talked about your notepads that you have access to. You might find those very helpful, because as you heard, the schedule in this case is going to span possibly over a month's time. So testimony that you hear today and tomorrow, you might not be able to remember a month from now when you are trying to weigh the evidence in this case. Okay, so use your notepad, as the judge said. You don't have to, but use your notepad if you need it. Okay, to remember details. Things that may be helpful for you to note in those notepads. You already heard it through voir dire. There are going to be a lot of doctors that are going to testify in this case. Things that you might find helpful to write down, maybe his or her specialty. What is the doctor's specialty? What are they trained in? What are they educated in? What diagnosis he or she made and why they made it? What reasons do they give for the diagnosis that they came to? Alternatively, conditions that they ruled out and why they ruled those conditions out. These may be things that are helpful for you when you are back there weighing the evidence at the end of this case. Something else that may be important for you are dates. Because I expect you're going to hear a lot of testimony about injuries and healing, things like that. Dates may assist you in analyzing that information. So dates may be helpful. So let's talk about dates. What I expect the evidence will show in this case, that on October 8th of 2021, Jamison Timms is born. Carrie and Brady Timms are his parents. And on October 18th of 2021, Jamison starts seeing Dr. Harvin Pickett as his regular pediatrician. You will hear that he went to have his shots, he went and had a circumcision, and they established primary care at that time. On November 18th, I expect that you will hear that Jamison went to Erlanger Hospital. And while he was at Erlanger Hospital, he had a full skeletal x-ray of every bone in his body, and that there were no injuries to his skeleton at that time. I expect that you will also hear on December 8th of 2021, Jamison had a follow-up to that appointment. They once again did a full skeletal x-ray of him. And there were again no injuries, no broken bones to Jamison Timms at that time. What I expect that you will hear is that on January 12th of 2022, Jamison is seen for an abrasion to his face and a cut underneath his tongue. He's seen at Dr. Harvin Pickett's office. And I expect that you will hear why that was concerning to Dr. Harvin Pickett, and why at that point in time, as a mandated reporter, she had to report this to DFACS. You will hear that DFACS then called the Timms on January 13th of 2022 and told them they had to go down to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta for Jamison to be checked out. You will hear that they went down there on the 13th. I expect you'll hear that a CT scan was done at that point in time. Jamison was admitted, and then on the 14th, Jamison has another skeletal x-ray at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta that showed he had 3 broken ribs and a compression fracture to his spine that had not been there before. These were new injuries, and that they were in various stages of healing. Fast forward to February 3rd of 2022. Jamison has a follow-up skeletal x-ray at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. and they can still see on that x-ray that he has those fractures that are still healing. The same fractures on his back to his ribs and that compression fracture. You will also hear, I expect, that on April 27th of 2022, there was a trip with DFACS, Ms. Timms, and Ms. Bullock, who I'll get to in a minute. They went to see a Dr. Hollick in Boston, and you'll hear about that trip. I expect you will also hear that on June 16th of 2022, Jameson goes back to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta for another follow-up. Another skeletal x-ray is done of Jameson, and at that point in time, all of the injuries have healed. And he has no new broken bones. I expect you will also hear that on June 21st of 2022, there was a trip to Chattanooga to see a geneticist, Dr. Kathy Stevens. Now, the evidence is going to show that there were the custody situation throughout this time frame is that on January 14th through January 21st of 2022, Jameson is placed in foster care. He's with a foster care mom and dad during that time, right after the injuries are found. You will then hear from January 21st through August 4th of 2022, Jameson is placed with Brady Tim's half-sister, Miss Bullock, and her husband, Mr. Bullock. Following the 4th of August, Brady Tim's parents take custody of Jameson, and DFACS is forced to close their case at that time. But what you will see is that during this entire time, there were no new broken bones. The evidence will show that there were no new broken bones. Well, after Jameson was taken out of the home. So who will you hear from during the course of this case? You're going to hear from people from DFACS, the Department of Child and Family Services. You will hear, I anticipate, from people that are part of their investigations, from foster care, from foster parent. You will also hear from court-appointed special advocates, CASA. You'll hear from them about this case and their involvement in it. You'll hear from law enforcement. Medical personnel. You are going to hear from a lot of medical personnel in this case. That will include pediatricians, child abuse specialists, radiologists, and specifically pediatric radiologists, geneticists, as well, and those are going to be the major players that you will hear from in this case. Now let's talk about the charges. You've already heard from the judge what the charges are. Here specifically are the charges themselves. So this is the indictment. This is count 1. And you will see the date of the allegation is after that Erlanger trip. The evidence will show, and then up until right before the first trip to show up. Did maliciously cause bodily harm to Jameson Timms by seriously disfiguring said person's body by breaking the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th ribs. And the evidence will show, again, those are going to be on his back. Count 2, also for that same date range, charges them with maliciously causing Jameson Timms, a child under the age of 18 years, cruel and excessive physical and mental pain by breaking these, he said, Jameson Timms' left, 8th, 9th, and 10th ribs. Count 3 alleges during the time of November 18th through December 30th, this is the charge for the vertebrae compression fracture. And it is alleging that they did maliciously cause Jameson Timms, a child under the age of 18 years, cruel and excessive physical pain by causing a compression fracture to the vertebral body, the T10 vertebrae on his back. Count 4 alleges between the 10th day of January of 2022 and the 13th day of 2022. This is for the facial injury as well as the cut underneath the tongue of Jamison Timms. What I expect that you will hear is that the defendants were the only caretakers of Jamison during the time that these injuries would have occurred. You may hear other theories about things that Jamison may have. You might hear that, but the evidence will show that the only thing that makes sense is that he has a constellation of injuries consistent with child abuse. You will hear, I expect the evidence is going to show that there is no medical explanation for this combination of injuries to have occurred on their own. And that is why, at the end of this case, the state will come back before you and ask you to render a verdict that is the only verdict that makes sense in this case, and find justice for Jamison, and find these two people guilty of these charges.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to be back speaking with you today after a very long week, last week of jury selection. And so again, I'll echo how grateful we are for your time. And we'll get right into it. The evidence is going to show that there is no way that those two individuals sitting at that table caused any injuries whatsoever to their infant child, Jamison Timms. A much loved, a much wanted child who did have some medical issues. That's why his mom was taking him to the doctor. She never realized that that simple act of trying to find out what was going on with her son might lead her to the nightmare that she and her husband have faced for the past 3 years. So, let's get into it. We expect the evidence is going to show, as we heard, that Brady and Carrie Timms were married. They had met all the way back in middle school. They had both had other relationships in their lives, and in fact, Brady came to their marriage with a stepson who's now 9 years old. But they very much wanted to have children of their own. And the evidence will show that Carrie Timms was not sure that she would ever be able to have children. She has some medical conditions of her own. As you can see your own self, she's a physically very tiny person. And she has a condition known as Ehlers-Danlos, which it deals with collagen production and the joints of the body. Brady Timms also has a history in his family of folks who have had back pain, fractures, and other injuries that we are now associating with the constellation of conditions that are known as brittle bone syndrome. This refers to, the evidence will show that this is referring to a condition overall known as osteogenesis imperfecta. Basically, that something goes a little bit different when your bones are being formed and you need that bone mineralization. The evidence is going to show, because you will be hearing from lots of doctors, that this can be caused by all sorts of things. Vitamin D deficiency, medications that people have been taking, including blood pressure medications, anti-nausea. You'll hear evidence that those things can actually affect the serotonin levels in your body, and that serotonin is a key ingredient of bone growth. And so you'll learn that these conditions are something that can affect the way that bones are created. And so Carrie was thrilled to learn that she was pregnant with Jamison. It wasn't always the easiest pregnancy. She did deal with nausea and blood pressure issues, which is why she was prescribed certain medications that she later learned could have an impact on bone mineralization for her child. But of course, she's an excited first-time mom. She's doing everything she can to stay healthy for the delivery of her baby. But the delivery of the baby wasn't an easy one. She actually went to the hospital, I believe it was, the evidence will show, 2 days before Jamison was actually delivered. And it was a very challenging delivery. She had to be given Pitocin and other medications in order to induce this very long, difficult delivery. And we believe the evidence will show that when it comes to the tiny healing fractures that some skeletal surveys showed on Jamison Tim's tiny body, that the only logical explanation for those tiny fractures that you will hear from multiple medical experts is that there may have been an excessive contractive force during that birth process that created tiny healing fractures on the edges of the 7th, 8th, and 9th ribs. So the birth goes as well as can be expected under the circumstances, and Brady and Carrie are overjoyed by their new son, Jamison. They're, as sometimes new parents are, worried about every little thing that pops up. And so, of course, they're taking their child to well baby visits, doing everything that's recommended from the doctor. But they had a scary experience in November when Jamison started displaying some markings on his body that didn't make sense. Carrie calls her friend who's a nurse and is concerned, what could this be? And so out of an abundance of caution, they take the child up to Erlanger in Chattanooga, which is where that skeletal survey was performed, where the full workup was performed, because the Tims are simply desperate to know what's going on with their child. And so at that point, blood work is done, skeletal x-rays are done, but unfortunately, Erlanger loses the blood work that was done in November. And so at that time, there is actually some interest from DFACS. They tried to look into what could be going on. But of course, after home visits, talking to the family, seeing what's going on, observing Jamison, observing the family, they realize there's no child abuse going on, and they simply hold on to what records they can until the next time that Jamison comes in to the doctor. And now, the evidence is going to show that the reason that Carrie and Brady carried Jamison to the doctor on January 12th of 2021 is that he had an abrasion on his cheek. He had scratched himself and it wasn't healing. Carrie had put coconut oil on it. That didn't seem to work, so she had tried some Basifor. But again, she was worried. It wasn't getting better, so she took the child to the doctor. And it was that visit with Dr. Sarah Harbin Pickett that resulted in the DFACS referral. And you'll hear about this injury that was alleged to have occurred under Jamison's tongue. But you'll also see the evidence shows that that injury was something that CHOA couldn't find the next day. So when you think about what happened on January 12th, what happened is that parents took their child to the doctor and followed all the instructions of the doctor, not knowing that at that point the trap had been laid for all of their actions as concerned parents to then become characterized as child abuse. There was a blizzard coming in on January 13th, 2022. And so everyone was a little bit worried about making the trip down to Atlanta as instructed. But of course, when the doctor says, we need to see your baby for something else, you're going to take your baby in to be seen. And so that's what the Tims did. They loaded up Jamison, they loaded up his stroller and his car seat and his bag of toys and everything, and took him down to CHOA, bringing grandparents with them to try to figure out what was going on with their baby. They didn't know that the steps had already been put into place for the state to seize custody of Jamison while they were still at the hospital and have Brady and Carrie escorted out by security before the blood results and workups were even back. And the evidence, it may sound a little bit crazy to y'all, and that's why it's going to be so important for you to listen to everything that comes to you from this witness stand and to listen to the evidence from the reports, because the evidence will be right there in the reports. that Jameson Timms was seized from his parents not because he was an abused and injured child, but because somehow an officer from Gordon County was the first person to make it down to CHOA on January 13th, 2022. That's right. The evidence will show that before any doctor at CHOA, at the Stephanie Blank Center for Healthy and Safe Children, before any doctor ever saw Jameson Timms, who they saw was Jody Faulkner sitting in the waiting room for hours and hours, giving the impression that somehow a child abuse investigation had been undertaken up in Gordon County. That simply wasn't the case. The evidence will show that Brady and Carrie were at all times compliant, appreciative, trying to do their best with the doctors. You will see that Carrie complained about the cleanliness of the room at Erlanger. Again, new mom, very concerned about the situation. But you will repeatedly hear from the doctors and see in their reports that this is a family who genuinely wanted to know what was going on, who followed the instructions of the doctors to try to see what was going on. Now, you will hear that Carrie was anxious and tearful when these issues came up about her child. And again, I think you'll understand that fairly naturally. You'll see that almost immediately this accusation of child abuse colored the entire treatment that the Timms family received at CHOA. That in fact, Jameson appeared as a perfectly healthy infant, but for the scratch on his face. That you'll hear the state refer to multiple broken bones, but you will see on the skeletal x-rays that this is not some child who has been struck or thrown against something, or that anything has been done with enough force to injure an infant that way. You'll see that the only thing that makes sense is what the multiple experts, the pediatric radiologists, the geneticists, the experts on blood coagulation will tell you is very likely a routine birth injury that many more children have than we ever find out about, because it is so difficult to do x-rays of a tiny infant. And in fact, you will hear that the x-ray to which Jameson was subjected at CHOA on January 13th even caused bruising on his back. And that this was one of those instances that terrified and frightened the Timms. When their baby was taken away from them, they asked to be able to watch and to see the proceeding, but they were denied that. And when Jameson came back to them, he was crying, upset, and had a bruise on his back that was not there before. So the experience at CHOA, you will hear, was immensely traumatic. And in fact, you will hear about the security guard simply escorting them out, only moments after they had just been told, we're waiting to get the blood work back. We need to see what's going on. But they didn't even wait to get that blood work back. So you will hear from the experts that CHOA had, that the state had access to, that their own blood work soon revealed a variant of unknown significance on the very genetic site that is responsible for collagen production, and that would be most likely to be related to the possibility of minor fractures or well, they call it a compression fracture, but the evidence is going to show from expert pediatric radiologists that at the most it was a loss of vertebral height that would have needed an MRI in order to determine if it could actually be characterized as a compression fracture. And you'll notice in the medical records that CHOA repeatedly refers to different vertebrae. Sometimes it's T10, sometimes it's T11, sometimes it's T12. But what we know is that none of those instances, the evidence will show, are related to child abuse, because you'll hear from experts like Dr. Hutchison, a pediatric radiologist, who will tell you that anything that would be significant enough to cause a compression fracture to an infant would also be associated with bleeding in the eyes, bleeding in the brain,
other serious injuries, and that this particular presentation has nothing to do with child abuse. You'll hear that from doctors who haven't examined Jamison. You'll hear that from doctors who have only looked at the test results, the inadequate test results from O.C.G.A. that were still sufficient to show the genetic variant related to osteogenesis imperfecta. But you'll also hear it from the doctors that have examined Jamison personally. And that's the question that you'll need to ask yourself as you listen to these witnesses, as you hear the evidence come before you. You'll have to ask, did these people lay hands and eyes on Jamison? Because you will hear a lot of evidence about DFAC's protocols and the actions that they took, and the investigation of the home of Brady and Carrie Timms that revealed nothing out of order, nothing whatsoever that would indicate any child abuse. You'll hear from the pediatric geneticist who has personally treated Jamison, who has treated countless families experiencing similar situations, who has seen examples of child abuse, and who is confident that there was no child abuse here whatsoever, and that you have a family who is honestly seeking any explanation for what may be going on with their child. So, you'll ask yourself, as each of the witnesses testify, have they examined Jamison? Are they in a position to make a judgment about whether or not these irregularities on the skeletal survey or these injuries that the parents brought the child in for themselves reflect any more than a common childhood incident, or whether they actually reflect the horrific, disgusting criminal intent that the state is alleging. Now, the object of this trial is to discover the truth. And the state is the one who has this very, very high burden of having to show to you through the evidence what allegedly happened to Jamison. But even in their opening statement, they can't tell you what happened to Jamison, because the evidence will show that the only thing that happened was that he had caring, loving parents who made sure to take him to the doctor for each and every little thing that could possibly be wrong. You will hear about the possibility of bone metabolic issues that are genetic and perhaps environmental. And you will hear about a DFAC's investigation that was not alone in its finding inaccurately of what was going on. You will hear evidence that unfortunately mistakes like this by DFACs have become so common and problematic and destroyed so many families that DFACs actually had to institute an entirely new protocol on February 14th of this year, 2025, that provides that in all cases where a diagnosis of non-accidental injury, i.e. child abuse, is being made by one of their child abuse pediatricians, i.e. people who are specialized in child abuse, that the parents are entitled to a second medical opinion. You'll hear how ridiculous it is that that had to be a new protocol, that they had to be able to get a second medical opinion. And you'll also hear that their new protocol is that every child abuse pediatrician is required to sign a medical attestation form that says, I have examined this child's medical history, and I am confident in my diagnosis of child abuse. But what you're also going to hear in this case is that none of the child abuse pediatricians who were involved, Dr. Stephen Messner, Dr. Verena Brown, or Dr. Carla Garcia, have signed such a form for Jamison Timms. And the state doesn't think that they have to. And so you'll hear evidence about why they might not want to do this. And it will be related to the fact that DFACs, well, they weren't forced to close the case. They closed the case because there was no evidence that these individuals ever intentionally harmed their baby. That is the evidence that you will hear about why DFACs has ceased in its efforts to limit
contact between Jamison Timms and Brady and Carrie Timms, his loving parents, who have fortunately been able to see him a great deal while he is in the custody of his grandparents.
Brady and Carrie don't come before you with any burden, and you will hear from them their own words, their own testimony, even though they have no obligation to do that, and the judge will instruct you that if they don't do that, you won't hold it against them. But in this situation, where the accusations are so simultaneously disgusting, horrifying, and frightening, and yet completely unspecific as to what actions the state even might believe would somehow cause an infant to have small fractures on the edge of his ribs, but no bleeding on the brain, no blood in the eyes, no other evidence whatsoever. And you will be able to take the evidence that you hear from the stand, the medical evidence, as well as the factual evidence, the evidence from the people who have seen Brady and Carrie Timms interact with their child, the people who have seen them take their child to the doctor and be concerned about what are the explanations for any of these conditions that he may have. And you will see even testimony from folks who understand the stress and trauma associated with the DFACS investigation, that at every stage they made themselves available. They didn't have anything to hide. And so, they won't come before you with evidence to show we know everything about the full genetic range of every single thing that could possibly be wrong with Jamison Timms. In fact, you'll hear evidence that Jamison is a happy, healthy boy, and that really the trauma in this case was associated with being ripped away from his parents. You'll see that in the medical records, and you'll see it in many places. But one that I'm going to ask you to start looking out for now is in the blood pressure that Choa recorded on January 13th, after his parents brought him down there thinking, we're going to find out what's going on with our baby, not realizing that the trap had already been set for them. And you'll see normal blood pressure for Jamison Timms. But then, when his parents are taken away from him, that blood pressure goes up. It goes up and you get the little exclamation mark that shows this is something to be worried about. And it never goes back down. That was a loved and wanted and baby who was treated with nothing but love and care from his parents for the entire 3 months of his short life. But the minute he was ripped away from them, his blood pressure went up and it never went down. Even the foster mother, the evidence will show that Jamison didn't appear to have anything wrong with him except that he wouldn't stop crying. And ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is going to show that that makes perfect sense. That he wouldn't stop crying because he was taken away from the people he loved and who loved him. Not dangerous abusers, but caring, loving parents desperately seeking an explanation for any small thing that could possibly be wrong with him. And you'll also hear, and keep an eye out for this, is this was all happening during some of the worst of the COVID pandemic. And so you'll repeatedly see references in the medical records to staffing limitations. Well, that was why we couldn't send a DFACS social worker down to Choa. We had staffing limitations, so we had to send a detective. Well, we couldn't come up with a safety plan to bring him back with his parents because of staffing issues, so we had to go ahead and seize him. So, ladies and gentlemen, over the next weeks, put yourself back in those
early days of the COVID pandemic, during this staffing time, and new parents who want nothing more than the best for their child and listen to every piece of evidence that comes from you, whether it's medical, whether it's fact, whether it's from people here in Calhoun, Georgia, who've grown up with these folks and know them, whether it's people who know them as parents, as friends, as church members, whether it's from medical doctors who only know them through medical records, or whether it's from medical doctors who know them from watching them interact with their child, Jamison Timms. And you will come to one conclusion from all of these people, and that is that there is no way that Brady and Carrie Timms abused Jamison Timms. And you might see evidence of the state trying to drive them apart and set them against each other and say, well, we know you didn't abuse your baby, but what if your husband or wife did? And you will hear evidence that neither one of them fell for that. You will hear evidence that Carrie Timms is in no way the kind of person who would ever tolerate anyone being violent or dangerous towards her baby. And you will ask yourself, who is honestly seeking the truth here? Who, with all the power to investigate and control the situation, who is honestly seeking the truth? And it will be Brady and Carrie Timms. And the truth that you will see is that they did not abuse Jamison Timms.